and across Britain, scattered behind overgrown hedges, hidden at the ends of country roads, or rising unexpectedly beyond modern housing estates and industrial parks, there are places like that. Old asylums, great hulking institutions of brick, stone, iron, and silence, buildings so large, so severe, so unnerving, self-contained, that even now, long after many used, they still seem to hold their breath. At night, they become something else entirely. The last light drains from the sky. A pale fog begins to gather over the grounds. It curls low across dead grass and broken paths, slipping around weeds that push up through cracked paving stones, wrapping itself around benches, boundary walls, and the skeletal remains of old garden rails. Trees, long untended, bend inward like witnesses. Their branches scrape softly against broken panes and loose drain pipes. Somewhere, a sheet of rusted metal knocks faintly in the wind. Then stops. And then there is only the building. Huge. Dark. Watching. The old Victorian walls rise out of the mist with a kind of grim authority, ends red-brained black by rain, soot, age, and neglect. Even in look disciplined. Imposing. Designed not only to contain bodies, but to overpower minds. Their length alone is unsettling. Block after block. Wing after wing. Rows of tall windows, many now shattered, many boarded, many staring out blank and dark, like empty eye sockets in a face too large to comprehend all at once. The entrance gates are often still there. Iron. Heavy. Ornamental ones, perhaps even grand in their own severe way. But now they hang crooked on their hinges, eaten by rust, flecked with lichen, frozen half open as though whatever passed through them last never meant to return. The gravel drive beyond them is usually swallowed by moss and weeds. If you stand there long enough, just outside those gates, in the wet cold of evening, you begin to understand something immediately. These places were never built to feel welcoming. They were built to separate. To remove. To keep one world inside, and another world out. And once you cross that threshold, even in imagination, the atmosphere changes. The air feels heavier. The silence changes shape. Because asylum silence is not ordinary silence. It does not feel peaceful. It feels interrupted. As though it exists on top of something else, something buried but not gone. Inside, the corridors stretch on in impossible lengths, dim even in daylight, swallowing sound and giving it back altered. Your footsteps would echo there, then flatten, then disappear. The floors, cracked lino, warped boards, chipped tiles, still remember the movement of thousands of bodies. Nurses hurrying. Orderlies wheeling trolleys. Patients pacing. Patients resisting. Patients being led. Patients being dragged. The sick, the frightened, the medicated, the forgotten. All of them passing under the same gas lamps, later the same electric lights, beneath ceilings now stained with spreading damp and hanging plaster. The walls peel in long curling strips. Paint flakes away from soaked plaster like dead skin. Moisture blooms in dark patches, creeping outward in bruised shapes. In some rooms, the wallpaper still clings on in fragments, floral patterns, institutional greens, faded creams. Ghostly attempts at gentleness in places where gentleness often ran out long before money did. Every surface seems to carry the memory of waiting. And the rooms. The rooms tell their own story. Dormitories where rows of iron bed frames still stand, bent and rusting, their wire springs collapsed inward like rib cages. Mattresses long gone. Blankets long gone. Pillows long gone. But the arrangement remains. Bed after bed after bed, lined with such rigid efficiency that even in emptiness, the room still feels supervised. You can almost picture it too easily. The thin sheets, the cold air, the coughing in the dark, the murmuring, the crying, the sudden screams, the footsteps of night staff approaching from somewhere down the ward. Then there are the side rooms. Observation rooms. Isolation rooms. Rooms with reinforced doors. Rooms where the paint is more scratched near the handle. Rooms where the window opens only a fraction. Rooms that feel smaller than their measurements. And deeper inside, old treatment spaces remain. Tiled, clinical, stripped bare, yet somehow more disturbing than the decayed wards. Rooms where enamel basins once stood. Rooms where instruments were cleaned. Rooms where water treatments were carried out. Rooms where sedation, restraint, examination, and correction all took place under the respectable language of medicine. The walls may be empty now, but emptiness in such places does not calm the imagination. It sharpens it. A rust mark on the floor becomes a question. A drain in the corner becomes a question. A leather strap left in a cupboard becomes a question. A wheeled metal frame left against a wall becomes a question. And perhaps most haunting of all are the records. Not always many. Sometimes just a few scraps. A ledger page. A patient card. A label fallen behind a cabinet. A file cover bloated by damp. Ink faded to brown. Paper turned soft by time. Names half legible. Dates of admission. Age. Condition. Religion. Next of kin. Occupation. Observations written in clipped institutional language. Violent. Melancholic. Delusional. Excitable. Dirty. Unmanageable. Improved. Not improved. Discharged. Transferred. Deceased. A whole human life reduced to a line. A mind in pain compressed into a diagnosis. A disappearance documented as paperwork. And in that moment, the building stops being simply eerie. It becomes tragic. Because these were not just abandoned hospitals. They were places where people were taken out of ordinary life and placed somewhere beyond it. Places where time changed meaning. Places where names were replaced by categories. Where grief, trauma, poverty, disability, illness, and social nonconformity could all be swept together behind one locked door and called, simply, insanity. For thousands upon thousands of men, women, and children in Britain, the asylum was not a brief interruption. It was an erasure. They disappeared from neighborhoods, from village life, from family routines, from workplaces, from parish records of ordinary living. One day they were a daughter, a laborer, a mother, a clerk, a widow, a schoolboy, a servant, a veteran, a sister. Then they became a patient. A case. An inmate. A burden to be managed. A problem transferred from home to institution. And once inside, many would remain there not for days, not for weeks, but for years. Sometimes for decades. Sometimes until death. Families sent relatives away for many reasons. Some did so in desperation, terrified by behavior they could not understand and unequipped to manage. Some hoped, sincerely, that medical treatment might help. Some were told the asylum would provide rest, care, order, food, supervision, safety, and perhaps even recovery. Some believed they were making the only merciful choice available in a society with few real alternatives. But not everyone was sent away because they were violently mad or profoundly unreachable. That is one of the darkest truths in this story. Some were sent because they were poor. Because they were difficult. Because they were traumatized. Because they drank. Because they grieved too loudly or too long. Because they had seizures. Because they could not learn in the expected way. Because they heard voices. Because they frightened their families. Because they had nowhere else to go. Because they were old and confused. Because they were women in distress. Because they were mothers after childbirth. Because they were considered sexually improper. Because they embarrassed someone. Because they resisted someone. Because they did not behave the way society demanded. And sometimes, because they were simply misunderstood in an age that mistook suffering for defect, difference for disorder, and inconvenience for pathology. That is what makes these ruins so disturbing. Not only the scale of them. Not only the architecture. Not only the rumors, the ghost stories, the decayed wards, or the spectacle of ruin, but the knowledge that behind every corridor was a human story, and many of those stories were stories of people who may never have belonged there in the way later memory likes to imagine. The popular image of the asylum is often simple. A place for the dangerously insane. A grim but necessary solution for people beyond the reach of family or society. A dark institution, yes, but somehow inevitable. Somehow separate from ordinary life. The truth is more unsettling than that. Because British asylums were never only medical spaces. They were social spaces. Political spaces. Moral spaces. Economic spaces. They were built under the language, but they were also shaped by fear, fear of disorder, fear of dependency, fear of unpredictability, fear of those who did not fit neatly into the rhythms and values of respectable society. Officially, they were places of refuge and treatment. Places where disturbed minds could be soothed by routine, quiet, fresh air work, and medical supervision. That was the promise. And to be fair, in their earliest vision, some reformers did genuinely believe they were creating something more humane than the brutality that had come before. Compared with chains, cells, neglect in poorhouses, and public spectacle, the asylum could be presented as progress. Order instead of chaos. Treatment instead of punishment. Shelter instead of abandonment. But history has a way of exposing the distance between promise and practice. Because behind those promises of protection and care, another reality grew. One of overcrowding. Neglect. Confinement. Control. Force guised as therapy. Punishment disguised. Silence disguised as order. And suffering disguised as treatment. The asylum system in Britain did not become dark merely because a few cruel people worked inside it. It became dark because the institution itself carried a dangerous contradiction at its heart. It claimed to heal, but it also existed to remove. It claimed to protect, but it also existed to contain. It claimed to treat, but it also existed to discipline. And once a place is built both to care for people and to hide them, the line between medicine and social control can become terrifyingly thin. Some asylums were undoubtedly better than others. Some staff were humane. Some doctors were earnest. Some patients did improve. Some families found relief. Some lives may even have been saved by admission. This history is not simple enough to reduce to one note, one slogan, or one image. But neither can it be softened. It became fuzzes, places where lives were not restored but managed into places where distress was processed bureaucratically. Places where unwanted people could be absorbed by a system large enough to outlast scrutiny and quiet enough to swallow protest. That is why these buildings still grip the imagination. That is why they remain so hard to look away from. Even now, when many have been demolished, redeveloped, converted into flats, or left to rot behind security fencing, old British asylums continue to exert a strange power over public memory. Photographers seek them out. Urban explorers break into them. Paranormal investigators whisper into their corridors. Historians dig through their archives. Local residents swap stories about lights in empty wards, heard through broken windows, shadows at upper floors where no one lives anymore. It is tempting to say these places are haunted. And perhaps, in the cultural imagination, they are. But maybe not in the way ghost stories usually mean. Maybe what haunts them is not an apparition in white at the end of a corridor. Maybe it is the scale of air. Maybe it is the suspicion that entire populations were hidden away in plain sight. Maybe it is the knowledge that these institutions were not medieval oddities or ancient castles from some barbaric era far removed from us. Meant to living memory. Many operated deep into the 20th century. Some were still shaping lives at a time close enough to touch the present. And that means the darkness attached to them is not safely distant. It belongs to modern Britain too. That is what gives these ruins their emotional weight. They are not. They are monuments to a hidden national trauma. Great physical reminders of a society that built enormous systems to classify suffering, isolate it, and manage it behind walls so high that the rest of the country could go on pretending those inside had simply gone somewhere necessary. Stand before one of these buildings long enough and it begins to raise uncomfortable questions. What really happened inside these institutions? What did admission feel like for the person arriving at those gates, frightened, confused, perhaps sedated, perhaps pleading, perhaps too exhausted to resist? What did the first night feel like? What did the first locked door sound like? What did to realize that your words might no longer be trusted because they came from your mouth? How many people were helped there, and how many were broken there? How many suffered from illnesses no one yet understood? How many were punished for symptoms? How many were condemned not by madness alone, but by poverty, gender, stigma, class prejudice, bureaucracy, and convenience? Why did some never come out? Why are so many stories still fragmented, hidden in ledgers, or buried beneath official phrases that reveal almost nothing about the terror, grief, humiliation, or loneliness of life inside? And why, after closure, after demolition, after redevelopment, after the weeds have taken the paths and the rain has stained the brick and the windows have gone blind, do these places still provoke such dread? Why do they still seem to radiate something more than decay? Why do they feel less like empty buildings, and more like evidence? Perhaps because that is what they are. Evidence that care can become control. Evidence that institutions built in the name of overtime become engines of silence. Evidence that societies often reveal their deepest fears not in the people they celebrate, but in the people they hide. And in Britain, the asylum became one of the most powerful machines ever built for doing exactly that. Tonight, in this story, we are going to walk slowly back through those gates. Not to sensationalize these places. Not to flatten them into ghost attractions. Not to pretend that every doctor was a monster or every patient an innocent victim of conspiracy. But to examine, carefully and honestly, the dark side of British asylums. The side written not in official speeches, but in overcrowded wards, treatment rooms, locked doors, censored letters, exhausted staff, forgotten graves, and lives that disappeared into institutional time. We are going to trace how the asylum system rose across Britain. Why it expanded so rapidly. What social anxieties helped build it. Why the language of care was so often intertwined with the logic of control. We are going to look at the brutal mechanics of the asylum system. How people were categorized, certified, admitted, separated from their homes, and absorbed into systems that could be almost impossible to leave. We are going to step inside the wards themselves. Into the routines of waking, washing, queuing, working, eating, waiting, being observed, being corrected, and trying, somehow, to retain a private self in a place designed to reduce private selves into orderly populations. We are going to look closely at women in asylums. Women whose grief, rage, defiance, sexuality, breakdown, and postpartum suffering were often interpreted through the narrow and deeply assumptions of their time. We are going to look at children too, and at those labeled defective, feeble-minded, unteachable, or unfit, lives shaped from an early age by institutional language that did not merely describe difference, but imprisoned it. We are going to examine the treatments that defined asylum medicine at different moments in history. And seclusion to hydrotherapy, sedation, and more invasive interventions that promised relief but often inspired fear. We are going to confront punishment as well as treatment. Neglect as well as care. The ways discipline could masquerade as therapy. The ways routine could become a weapon. Stripped naked, smashed windows, threatened neighbors, spoke of devils, refused food, wandered endlessly, or disrupted worship could quickly become a communal problem. And once someone became a communal problem, the language around them changed. They were no longer merely suffering. They were troublesome, scandalous, disorderly, dangerous. There was, at this stage, no modern psychiatric map to separate one condition cleanly from another. A single catch-all word could contain widely different realities. People suffering from trauma or war might be grouped with those experiencing severe psychosis. A woman shattered by childbirth could be classed alongside someone with lifelong developmental impairment. An elderly person with dementia might be treated as though they were morally erratic. Someone having seizures could be feared as unstable or uncanny. A person with syphilitic brain disease, a person in deep depression, a person with autism, a person in delirium from fever, a person hearing voices, and a person drunk beyond reason might all be described using overlapping terms of madness or lunacy because society lacked better distinctions, and often lacked the will to make them. This is one of the most important to understand before the asylum age. When older Britain spoke of madness, it was often talking about many different things at once. And that meant the response to madness was often improvised, inconsistent, and deeply shaped by class, family resources, local custom, and social tolerance. Long before vast state institutions, the first place where mental distress was usually handled was the home. The household was the original asylum in the broadest word. Not an institution, but a place of shelter, supervision, endurance, and sometimes imprisonment. Families carried the burden first. They watched. They interpreted. They hid. They soothed. They restrained. They prayed. They waited for improvement. And sometimes they simply endured for as long as they could. In wealthier homes, there might be more space, more privacy, more servants, more ability to keep suffering out of public view. A disturbed relative could stay in an upper room, cared for by kin or attendants, protected from spectacle, and managed with the family's reputation still largely intact. But for the poor, luxury. A cramped cottage, a house full of children, illness, labor, and hunger. These were not environments where prolonged mental crisis could be contained gently. When one person's behavior became unpredictable, the whole household could tip into instability. Sleep vanished. Neighbors noticed. Employers complained. Children were frightened. Rent went unpaid. Food ran short. Self-harm or wandering became harder to prevent. Poor families were expected to care, but often without the means to do so. And in that gap between expectation and possibility, the darker side of community care emerged. Because care in pre-asylum Britain could be compassionate, but it could also be brutal. Some relatives protected vulnerable family members for years, shielding them from public ridicule and doing what they could with almost no support. There are stories, scattered across records and recollections, of immense patience, sacrifice, and tenderness. A mother sitting through the night with a son in delirium. Sisters washing and feeding a confused father. Neighbors keeping an eye on a harmless wanderer known to the parish. Clergy or local women offering practical help to mothers in mental distress. But there are other stories too. Stories of confinement in back rooms. Of ropes. Of beatings. Of neglect so deep it became indistinguishable from abandonment. Of family shame turning into